best bring the Ukraine crisis, this geopolitical crisis, to an end, it's important to first start by acknowledging Russia's interests. So what we're talking about here tonight is how best to end this crisis. We're not talking about who started it, who should be blamed. We're not talking about whether Vladimir Putin is a good guy or a bad guy. The question here is how best to end it. Now, this is referred to as a geopolitical crisis in the motion. My view is that it's much more than a geopolitical crisis. This is a geopolitical disaster. First of all, look at what's happening to Ukraine. This country is in the process of being destroyed. The war is only 78 days old. If this war goes on, you can only imagine what's going to happen to Ukraine. Estimates are by the World Bank that over $60 billion worth of damage has been inflicted on Ukraine. Some people say that it will take $600 billion to rebuild the country. Thousands of people have been killed. Cities have been destroyed. 5 million people have left the country. 6 million people are internally displaced. 13 million people are living in combat zones. For the sake of the Ukrainian people, it's essential to bring this to an end. Furthermore, we run the risk here that this war, which is now between Ukraine and Russia, is going to turn into a war between Ukraine and the United States. It's going to turn into a great power war. This is a really scary thought. We know very well that when wars become long wars, they tend to escalate. And the last thing we want is a war between the United States and Russia. And the reason is because the threat of nuclear war is on the table. Now, many of you might think this is not a serious possibility, but that would be a fundamental mistake. You should understand what America's goal is in this war. America's goal is to inflict a decisive defeat on Ukraine, number one, and number two, to bring the Russian economy to its knees with economic sanctions. If you listen to General Austin, who is the Secretary of Defense, he's basically talking about knocking Russia out of the ranks of the great powers. This is another way of saying we are presenting Russia with an existential threat. Now, does that mean that they will use nuclear weapons? Nobody can say for sure, but there is a serious possibility. Avril Haines, who's the director of national intelligence, said on Tuesday when appearing in Capitol Hill that one of the two scenarios in which Russia will use nuclear weapons is if it is being defeated in Ukraine. Well, our basic goal is to defeat Russia in Ukraine. So we have a very perverse paradox here. The paradox is that the better the United States does on the battlefield, with the Ukrainians doing the fighting, of course, the more likely it is that Russia will turn to nuclear weapons, and we might end up in a general thermonuclear war. We have to end this war to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, the motion says that we start by taking into account Russia's interests. This does not mean that we don't consider the interests of Ukraine, the interests of the United States, the interests of NATO. Of course we take into account their interests. But we start with the Russians, and the reason we start with the Russians is very simple. They started the war. And what we have to do is figure out what their interests are, because if we don't know what their interests are, there's no way we can shut this one down. So we're starting with Russia's interests. Now the question is, what are Russia's interests? The conventional wisdom, which I'm sure all of you have heard ad nauseum, is that Vladimir Putin is responsible for this war. Vladimir Putin is an imperialist. He's either trying to create a greater Russia or he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. And what's going on here is that Ukraine is a country that he wants to conquer and incorporate into Russia. He wants to absorb it. There is absolutely no evidence to support that argument. There is no evidence that he thinks that's desirable. There's no evidence that he thinks that's feasible. And there's no evidence in the public record that he's ever said that that's what he intends to do. This is a crisis that is all about the West's efforts to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border. It involves a three-pronged strategy: bringing Ukraine into the EU, turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy, and number three, and most importantly, bringing Ukraine into NATO. If you listen to Putin's speeches and you read his writings, he has made it unequivocally clear that this is the principal problem: Ukraine joining NATO. And what has to be done here to solve this problem is Ukraine has to become a neutral country. Ukraine cannot become a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. You may not like that outcome, and I fully understand that. But if you are interested in preventing Ukraine from being completely destroyed, and you are interested in avoiding a nuclear war, you should be in favor of the motion. I want to make three sets of points, and they all have to do with data. Mike makes the argument that Putin alone, or just Putin and a few Russian leaders, are interested in Ukraine and the whole subject of NATO. This is what one of Mike's predecessors, Bill Burns, said in 2008 in a memo to Condi Rice. Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russians, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin and Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have never met anyone who thinks that Ukraine in NATO is acceptable. Second, to go to Mike again, let me go to Rodin this time. He made the argument that that Putin, in his famous July 12, 2021 essay, made it clear that what he was interested in doing was conquering Ukraine and absorbing it into a greater Russia. This is what he actually wrote. He said, this is in the July 12, 2021 article, "And what Ukraine will be, it is up to its citizens to decide." He also said, "You want to establish a state of your own?" And he's talking to the Ukrainians here. "You are welcome." In the February 24th speech where he announced that he was invading Ukraine, he said, "Accept these new geopolitical realities." He said, "We, Russia, accepts the new geopolitical realities after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. He said regarding Ukraine, "We respect and will respect their sovereignty." There is no evidence in that talk, on February 24th or in his speech that he was interested in conquering Ukraine and integrating it into Russia. And then finally, with regard to Rodin's argument that NATO was a dead issue in 2021, at the June 14th, 2021 NATO summit in Brussels, we issued a communique that said, "We reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. We reaffirm all the elements of that decision." That argument was repeated in November 10th, 2021. Well, I'd make a couple points. First of all, I think the liberal world order is in tatters at this point in time. I mean, not only do you have a serious conflict between the United States and Russia, but you have a serious conflict or competition brewing in East Asia between the United States and China. The unipolar world where the United States pursued liberal hegemony is gone, and we're now in a multipolar world where security competition among great powers is back on the table, which leads me to the heart of your question. The sad fact is that in international politics, minor powers have to pay really serious attention to what great powers think and what great powers believe their interests are. Steve has made this point at great lengths, that a great power, whether it's the United States or Russia, will behave in a brutal fashion if it thinks its interests are being threatened. And the Russians believe that their interests are being threatened in Ukraine, that if Ukraine becomes a Western bulwark on their border, that is, in effect, an existential threat to them. Mike and Radek can disagree with that, but that's what the Russians think. And when great powers think like that, they behave in brutal ways. And my view, and I've long said this about Ukraine, it is in Ukraine's national interest to act smartly with regard to Russia and not poke the Russian bear in the eye with a stick, because it will lead to a situation like the one that you now face. Am I happy about the fact that this is the way the world works? Absolutely not. But I am a realist, and I think Ukraine would be much better off today if it had acted according to the dictates of realism. Well, I wanted to actually ask Mike a question, but I'm afraid to ask him a question because he'll go on for another 20 minutes. Look, you just want to keep in mind here what the issue on the table is. We're talking about how to end this war. We're not talking about what happened in Libya in 2011. Really, who cares? The question is, how do we end this war? And it really matters because of what's happening to the Ukrainian people and because of the threat of nuclear war. And the argument on the table is that you have to pay serious attention to Russian interests. And when you talk about Russian interests, it's what they think their interests are. Now, Mike and Radek go to great lengths to try and describe what they think Russia's interests should be. And I think the Bill Burns quote is very important here, because Bill Burns, unlike you, said that NATO expansion, they have lots of voice. There's no question that the Ukrainians have voice, and there's no question that the Ukrainians have agency. But the problem is, when you live next door to a guerrilla, if you do certain things that antagonize the guerrilla is going to come after you and do horrible things to you. If in 20 years, Canada formed a military alliance with China and invited China to put military forces in Canada, what do you think the United States would do? I guarantee you the United States would behave towards Canada in very similar ways to how Russia is behaving towards Ukraine. We have the Monroe Doctrine, and we would never tolerate Chinese forces in Canada. We would never tolerate Canada forming a military alliance with China. You might not like this, but this is the way the world works. And I believe Canadians are sophisticated enough to know that this is a bad idea. Okay. The argument that NATO was fading in 2021 is simply wrong.
I said 14.
It wasn't fading in 2014, and it certainly is not fading in 2021. Have you ever asked yourself why the Ukrainians are doing so well against the Russians? It's not simply because of Russian military incompetence. It's because we have been arming the Ukrainians, we have been training the Ukrainians, we have been including them in military exercises like Operation Sea Breeze, right? We have been integrating them in very subtle ways into NATO. And furthermore, as I said before in my rebuttal, we have made a series of declarations over the course of 2021 where we made it clear that the declaration that we made at the Bucharest summit in 2008 was alive and well. This is why the Russians were scared stiff that Ukraine was going to become part of NATO. This is why in mid-December of 2021, the Russians made it very clear they wanted a written guarantee from the United States and from NATO that said Ukraine would not become part of that alliance. They were scared, and they were scared because Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of the alliance. Mike's argument is that we don't work out a settlement because that involves appeasing Putin. That involves turning Ukraine into a neutral buffer state. We don't do that. So instead, what we do is we continue to arm Ukraine, we continue to get more deeply involved, and we try to help to Ukrainians to decisively defeat the Russians in Ukraine. And furthermore, with our sanctions, we bring the Russians to their knees. And we ultimately, as I said in my opening comments, we knock them out of the balance of power, okay? The question you want to ask yourself, and this is the question all of you want to ask yourself, is where does this lead, right? Just think about what Ukraine is going to look like. Just think about the threat of nuclear escalation. The longer this war goes on, the more likely it is the Americans will become involved. The more likely it is that the war will turn nuclear. This would be a disaster of the first order. We have a deep-seated interest in shutting this one down now. And that means paying serious attention to what the Russians consider to be their interests. And their main interest is to make Ukraine a neutral state. My personal view is that if you got a deal that created a really, truly neutral Ukraine, you could get the Russians to give up everything except Crimea. In case you haven't noticed, Putin is not even capable of conquering Ukraine. The idea that he's going to conquer Poland is laughable in the extreme.
They did so many times in the past.
The past is the past. There's a new balance of power in Europe. Build on what Radek said that I wrote in 1993. I was probably the only person in the West who said that Ukraine should not give up its nuclear arsenal. And my argument was because someday the Russians may threaten to invade Ukraine, and Ukraine should have nuclear weapons. The vast majority of people in the West, and many Ukrainians said at the time, that Ukrainians and Russians are basically blood brothers and blood sisters, and that's inconceivable. And therefore, John Mearsheimer's views are out of touch with reality. In a way, Mike, people were arguing at the time views similar to what Putin said in his July 12, 2021 article. Anyway, we took away their nuclear weapons. Then we encouraged them to join NATO. We said they were going to join NATO. We, in effect, poked the Russian bear in the eye, and we left them defenseless. We, in effect, have led the Ukrainians down the primrose path. I have no idea.
What do you think?
I think that we are living in a world of radical uncertainty where it comes to what this is going to end up looking like. And I think there is a real possibility, I'm not saying it's likely, but there's a real possibility of nuclear use. And I think that should scare the living daylights out of all of us, and that should create an imperative to shut this one down. I want to make it clear, I disagree completely with Radek on the point that Russia is an imperial great power and that Ukraine is the first train station on the line. And when they're done conquering and incorporating Ukraine, there'll be additional countries. There is no evidence to support that. It's true if you look at the July 12th, 2021 talk. It's true if you look at Putin's February 21st and February 24th talks this year. This is all about the West's effort to make Ukraine a bulwark, a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And the key prong in our strategy is NATO expansion. If you just go look at the documentation, you'll see an abundance of evidence of that. And you can find no evidence that Putin is an imperialist. What we have here is a choice between two bad alternatives. One alternative is we can reach an accommodation with the Russians and, through diplomacy, work to create a neutral Ukraine. That's one alternative, and it's the alternative that Steve and I favor. The other alternative, and this is the Biden administration's policy, is to double down and to try to defeat the Russians in Ukraine, to bring the Russian economy down through comprehensive sanctions, and as I said on a number of occasions, to knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. That's the alternative. You have to choose between those two. And our argument is that the second alternative is extremely dangerous, and it's going to be terribly damaging for the Ukrainians. It makes more sense to cut a deal here. And what you really want to think about is the one crisis before this that looks a lot like the situation we're in today, and that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. We now know that when the United States got involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis, what President Kennedy did was he went to enormous lengths to shut the crisis down. He cut a deal with Khrushchev. He cut a deal with Khrushchev that he thought was so objectionable to the American people that he told Khrushchev that he was going to have to lie about the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which he was going to take out. Right? Kennedy understood we were talking back then about the threat of nuclear war. And Kennedy understood that you definitely wanted to do everything you can to avoid that. So what I'm saying to all you folks in the audience is you want to think like John F. Kennedy in this crisis, not like Joe Biden.